Hey, it's Eric G. Around the House is sponsored by Baldwin Hardware. For 75 years, Baldwin Hardware has been known for its first-class quality and craftsmanship in door and cabinetry hardware. As an alumnus of the Baldwin Hardware Design Council, I can say I have seen the details and quality from design to the finished product. If you're looking for a new style and old-world craftsmanship, I can tell you there is only one Baldwin Hardware. Check out what would look great in your home at baldwinhardware.com.
It's Around the House.
On this for you. From about 1940 to 1980, I will tell you that, and the word I use is ubiquitous, asbestos was used in virtually all building materials other than wood, glass, and metal. Everything else, all bets are off. So we find it very commonly in sprayed-on textures on walls and ceilings, troweled-on textures. You talked about 9x9 tiles. I'm going to say 80 to 90% of the ones that we test in the 9x9 inch range test positive for asbestos, as does the mastic usually that's holding those down. We have maybe 40% of the 12x12 tiles.
When it comes to remodeling and renovating your home, there is a lot to know, but we've got you covered. This is Around the House.
Welcome to Around the House with Eric G. and Caroline B., where we talk home improvement every single weekend. Thanks for joining us. Hello, Caroline. How are you?
Hello. I actually feel like the third wheel today. I feel like I shouldn't be here. I feel like I should be out.
We have a very special guest, Handyman Bob, in the studio. Welcome back to your Around the House, Handyman Bob.
Hey, it's great to be back with you. And Caroline, you're never a third wheel.
Thank you.
So before we start talking about asbestos and everything environmental inside your home that can be bad for you, we got to get everybody up to speed on Handyman Bob's history here with Around the House. He was the host and co-host of this show for nearly a decade and was my former co-host. And there was a day that he wanted his weekends back, and he handed me the torch, and we have run with it up to here. But we have Handyman Bob and his suspenders right back on the show again.
Well, I'll tell you what, that wasn't a torch I passed off. It was a microphone, but you've been flaming it ever since.
There were days I was wondering if it was a hand grenade, but you know how it goes. This is radio and podcasting. Well, thanks for coming back on, brother. This is great.
I wouldn't have missed it. I appreciate the invite.
Always welcome on here. Well, you and I were talking about it, and this is something that you and I have talked about in the past, and Caroline and I love talking about it, but, you know, we still are seeing, and I'm seeing this on social media, on all the home improvement groups out there, the misunderstanding of asbestos and how to deal with it in your home. And you have started an EnviroTest years ago, testing environmental stuff inside the house and building materials in the Portland area. And I wanted to dive into that with you so we could chat with you about it today.
Okay, great. Let's go.
So contractors, homeowners call you up, for instance, and say, okay, I'm starting a remodel project. Mm-hmm. And I know as far as Oregon code and Washington code that you have to be part of that process to follow the rules, correct?
That's correct. And in fact, the rules dictate that prior to beginning any renovation or demolition project, a contractor is required to test all the materials that will be disturbed to see if there is the presence of asbestos. Does not fall true on homeowners. Inside your home, Caroline, you're the queen of your castle. Mm-hmm. You can do almost anything you want to do, but if you're a contractor, the onus is upon you to hire somebody. Correct. And it was in January of 2016 that the state of Oregon, I say, reinforced the asbestos rules. You remember this time well, Eric. We were getting calls the end of 2015 from our contractor contacts, our listeners, And they were saying, what is going on down at the transfer station? They're telling us we're going to have some kind of an asbestos test. Well, Eric, this was when I became, I think, the luckiest guy on earth. And luck is defined as the intersection of preparation and opportunity. I was prepared. The opportunity presented itself. January 1, 2016 is when the rules were reinforced. By the 13th day of January, I had my federal inspector's license. And by the first day of February, I was taking my first samples.
There you go. There you go. So what are you seeing out there, Bob? And I know Caroline's probably got a bunch of questions on this stuff too, even though she's an expert in this as well. But, you know, it's funny. There's so many misconceptions about asbestos. You know, I see so many people go, oh, before 1980 is what that rule is on asbestos. And there's just this common thing where people almost confuse lead and asbestos together on when those materials were used in building materials.
It's easy to conflate them because 1978 is the cutoff date when lead-based paint it was made illegal to use in residential structures. And people do conflate asbestos and lead-based paint at that point. So you're right. Another thing that happened was that was 1986 that the EPA was granted full authority to regulate asbestos. So people hear 86 and they say, oh, well, asbestos was made illegal and so on. So there are a lot of confusing dates, but the bottom line is asbestos is still a legal commodity, could be used extensively in the United States if a manufacturer chose to. However, there's a little thing known as litigation. We are the most litigious country in the world, I believe. And as such, with mesothelioma lawsuits hanging over manufacturers' heads for past use of asbestos that is now causing health concerns, they've found workarounds. They found things that replace the asbestos. And we should talk about that at some point is why was it used and was it really necessary? Was it any good?
So I've got a lot of information. Here we go. So we opened up a big can of worms. The reason that I got into environmental, I guess, consulting, if you will, and it wasn't a conscious thing. It was something that happened to me when I was young. I was very close with my grandfather. He was extremely prevalent in my life and someone that I really admired and looked up to. He worked for Johns Manville for many, many years. He was brought out over, he came from Slovakia or the region, Czech Republic. He was brought over. He worked in the coal mines. He went down into these really, terrible conditions and worked as a coal miner, which you can imagine. I think it's probably one of the hardest jobs I think anybody can do. And then he ended up, Johns Manville came to these parts of Pennsylvania and said, look, we'll make a great life for you. Come and work at our factories. And we're going to, provide you with homes and places for your family and money. And so he did. And he ended up working there for his entire career. And of course, died and in his 80s, developed mesothelioma and was constantly, at some point before that being checked regularly for asbestosis, which obviously can turn into mesothelioma. And so I didn't know it, but watching him go through that process sort of gave me, Bob, that I guess that understanding that companies don't really look out for us and they don't necessarily are not thinking about the health of their workers. And it wasn't something that was directly, it was sitting in the back of my mind. And I guess I always wanted to help people and understand and kind of work against the man, if you will, and sort of make these conditions better. But I never really understood it until many years later that this was the reason why, because I saw my grandfather suffer from this horrible disease. So with that being said, I think you're so right. Like, why was this product ever manufactured? But it was manufactured in a place they thought they were making a better life for people and providing these products. And in the town itself, it was completely condemned and they had to do tons of restoration, remediation to the grounds and all of that around Johns Manville factory, which was in Manville, New Jersey, to make it right years after. I mean, it used to look like it was snowing. My parents grew up in that area. And so you'd go out in the middle of the summer and you see this stuff that looked like snow and it was the asbestos just falling out of the sky.
And It probably wouldn't surprise you to know then, Caroline, that the snow that we saw on early television and the snow that we sprinkled onto our windowsills and flocked our trees with at Christmas time was pure raw asbestos.
My
That's
mom was
pretty
an
scary.
my mom was an elementary school teacher in the 60s. And they would sit there in third grade, be making clay projects that they would send home to the parents that were made with clay, and they'd fire them in the kiln and do the whole process. And they mixed in asbestos with the clay to make them so they could make ashtrays and stuff that would hold up better for the heat and stuff for ashtrays with the kids. And they were sprinkling and mixing it right in the middle of third grade.
Absolutely. And it made those ashtrays stronger and far more fireproof and all of the good things. And in fact, in the 60s, my mother was a cigarette smoker. And at one point in time, she was smoking a cigarette called Kent. It was made by the P. Lorillard Company, as I recall. The filter on the Kent cigarette was known as a micronite filter. 100% pure asbestos.
I know.
So not only
Hey,
are you
hold my
sucking-
beer. Let's make asbestos. Let's make
Exactly.
smoking worse.
Oh my goodness.
So you're, not only are you sucking in tar and nicotine, but you're sucking in raw asbestos. Well, I watched my mother die, and she died. I'm sure had we had an autopsy, there would have been just huge lung scarring. Would have had probably mesothelioma, although it was never diagnosed. At the very least, it was COPD or emphysema or something of that nature. But toward the end, her mouth would open and close, and she couldn't draw air.
It's terrible.
She was like a fish on the dock.
And
Yeah. Not comfortable, not
And what
good.
I think our listeners have to understand is that these things don't affect you immediately. It's not something where you're going to see an impact and you're going to know that you were exposed. And so years after an exposure, you have to worry. Like my uncle worked at the factory, so he has to worry now later in life. My father worked at the factory. He paid to give my mom her engagement ring. That's how we worked during the summer. So all of these people were exposed, but now later in life in their 80s and 70s, starting usually 60s, 70s, you have to start to be monitored for these things, and they can just have this impact that you never were expecting. So it's a long-term thing. It's not something that's going to happen quickly.
It's an amazing thing. From the first exposure, let's call it the critical exposure. It's the one that ultimately develops into mesothelioma. The latency period is 20 to 70 years. From exposure to onset of mesothelioma, 20 to 70 years. So the 20-year-old who's working in the home remodeling industry today, by age 40 may see signs. By the same token, it may not occur until he's 90 years old. So this is, and the people that you're talking about who were in the Johns Manville plants and who were working in shipyards and who were boiler makers, lagging boiler pipe, things of that sort, they were exposed to huge volumes of stuff. They're now, if they're going to die, they're now in their 90s typically. And are dying of mesothelioma. But that is only one group of people where the increasing death rate is occurring. The other group of people is in their 40s and 50s. Well, where are they coming from? Because by the time, they weren't lagging pipe. They weren't building ships for World War II. They weren't working at a Johns Manville plant making roofing. They were remodeling commercial and residential structures. That's the second wave, and it's occurring now.
Well, Bob, there's so many misconceptions as well as what building materials that you're finding asbestos in. That's something that you have to deal with. And, I'll jump on the social media groups, the Facebook groups for home improvement and old houses and things like that. And it's jam-packed full of misinformation. You see people going, oh, 9x9 tiles are bad, 12x12 tiles are good, and the list goes on and on. What are you seeing? You do tests, your company does tests every single day. Of course, the real answer is you always have to test it, but what are some of the products that are most common?
I'm going to put a date group on this for you. From about 1940 to 1980, I will tell you that, and the word I use is ubiquitous. Asbestos was used in virtually all building materials other than wood, glass, and metal. Everything else, all bets are off. So we find it very commonly in sprayed-on textures on walls and ceilings, troweled-on textures. You talked about 9x9 tiles. I'm going to say 80 to 90% of the ones that we test in the 9x9 inch range test positive for asbestos, as does the mastic usually that's holding those down. We have maybe 40% of the 12x12 tiles that we test that had asbestos in it. And if you go back to the 60s, there's a great radio commercial. Actually, it was early television commercial. Now with more asbestos for longer wear.
Oh, no.
Yep.
Armstrong Tile.
Armstrong Tile. I have an ad. I think I brought into the studio one time to you. That was the, it's an ad out of like Women's Day magazine or Good Housekeeping back in like 1966. And now with added asbestos for durability.
Absolutely. So those are areas where you find it, and you find it in things you wouldn't even expect. Window glazing, that sealant putty that holds the glass into the window sash itself. It has a small amount of it sometimes. We don't find any in roofing anymore other than potentially, and once in a great while, the felt paper or tar paper underneath the roofing. But I think we've gone through all of the Johns Manville asbestos containing roofing that was out there, because roofing does have a finite life and people get it torn off their house or their commercial building, and it's been disposed of by now.
But there's always that risk of those people that went and put 3 roofs on the building, and even though it was against building code and common sense, there still could be a 50, 60, 70-year-old roof underneath there just because there's 3 or 4 layers up there because somebody got really lazy and or really cheap.
That is a distinct possibility. You're absolutely right. And so when it comes time to test, even though in the state of Oregon there is an exemption for 3-tab shingle roofing, if we run into one of those where you can just grab a handful of the roofing material and it just disintegrates basically into your hand, we'll throw that in a sample bag as well, just to rule it out.
Gotcha. And of course, one of my favorite siding materials is the asbestos siding out there. There is not much more durable with it, but when dealt with incorrectly, it can be dangerous.
Yeah, and you just said the operative word, incorrectly. And it brings us to a couple of terms that are important in the world of asbestos: friable and non-friable. Now, those 9x9 tiles we were talking about, the 12x12 vinyl tiles we were talking about, even the mastic that's holding them to the floor, it's a petroleum-based product. That siding you're talking about, water pipe, Gladstone, Oregon,
Nice.
the entire
Way to
city
go, Eric.
is piped
Suck down some
with
water.
asbestos piping. What does that mean? Well, it means that in the cement was put an asbestos binder. So,
Awesome.
it's done all over the country.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about friable and non-friable, because that siding really is not dangerous unless you belt sand it or get real aggressive with hand tools and smash it up and break it up. And it can be taken off one piece at a time, as long as it's not thrown into the dumpster and forming lots of little tiny pieces. The same way with the floor tiles. Those are considered non-friable because the matrix, the cement and the vinyl, bind the asbestos so tightly that it's almost impossible to break it loose. On the other hand, the texture on your wall, whether it's a light texture like an orange peel or a heavy Venetian plaster type of a texture or a knockdown texture on a ceiling, things like that, those are very friable. It means friable, if you look up the definition of it, it means you can powder it by hand. You can make non-friable materials friable through more aggressive action, but at least that's the way the state interprets it. However, friable is a common term, and it's easy to spot something that's friable because it means it's soft and pliable, or not pliable, soft and powderable. Now you're raising dust, and that's what got your grandfather, Caroline, was the dust, the environment he was in. There were no dust controls and no personal protective equipment. I've seen pictures of people working in plants where asbestos products were manufactured. You can't see the people through the dust cloud, and it's raw asbestos.
There's a couple things too that you're touching on. That one, I think about my grandmother, because my grandmother used to do his laundry, and she died of some sort of internal lung cancer, and she went first. So we never thought to have her tested, right? Like you said with your mom, it just wasn't an option at that point. He got cancer much later. So, and he was part of the lawsuit and all of that. So he had worked there, but my grandmother was breathing in all that dust off of his clothes. And I think this is true for anyone in the contracting industry. When you come home and you throw the stuff that you wear into the laundry, I've always been one that says we want a separate laundry for our work clothes, because, you don't know what you're exposed to. At this point, it's asbestos, but who knows down the line? It may be PVC. It may be any of these other things that we work with every day that become a problem. Silica dust, one of them. And then the other thing we're talking about is I see here a lot of, we have a lot of illegal immigrants. We have people that are working that maybe they're not illegal to the country, but they're working, without having insurance and licensing and contracting them. The contractors or the general contractors are paying them under the table. And so I see a lot of, it happens to be Hispanics, Mexicans, working what I call illegally, but they're removing this stuff without masks. They're throwing things into dumpsters. And I don't know that I'm trying to say it in the most like PC correct way, but these people are exposed to all of these things and there's no care for them at all. Like they're just throwing them into the field and having them rip down construction, and they're in there without any PPE. It's kind of scary.
We're waiting and hoping that OSHA catches that contractor.
And I can say in New Jersey, I mean, you can go to your local, we have Wawa here. I joke with Eric. Eric doesn't have, he was like, Wawa, 7-Eleven. But these workers sit outside these places waiting for contractors to come pick them up for the day. I don't know if this happens in Oregon, but this is a big thing here. They get picked up and they work for the day, they get cash, and then they go home and they're never seen again, or they go with a different contractor the next day. So no protection for them whatsoever. And it's sad. It's very sad.
Yeah. The state of Oregon has made it much harder for that to happen here because they are fairly aggressive on that. I mean, we had and I think, Bob, I'm not going to use this person's name, but I think that they were a house flipper in Lake Oswego here where I live. 5 or 6 years ago, they did some asbestos tests and hired a company like that to come in and do the abatement that was not a certified abatement company, and they got hit with a $100,000 fine. Now, I think they negotiated that back down later on through court appeals, but it was a hefty fine that they wanted to make an example out of.
And that's as it should be. It's unfortunate that that same company changed its name, started up, is probably doing the same thing.
Yep.
Because the money is there to cover the fines. It really is a sad situation. And Caroline, you mentioned the clothes, and Eric, you were asking about where do we find asbestos. One of the areas that we frequently overlook is the industrial side of things. How about the brake mechanic or the clutch mechanic? And Eric, this is right in your wheelhouse. You are the mechanical wizard. There was a time when all brake pads contained asbestos. And in fact, one of the leading sponsors of NASCAR and other racing is Asbestos. Well, where does the Bestos come in the Asbestos? Hello.
I'm going to use air quotes. Organic is a word.
That's
and inorganic.
Now. Yes, if you want asbestos brakes, I'm here to tell you can find them. They are just simply, you go into the AutoZone or O'Reilly or any of the others, and you ask for organic brakes, and you're going to get asbestos brakes. So they're still available, just not in the quantity that we saw them back in the day. But that old brake tech, first thing he pulled out when he opened up the wheel was his air gun. He wanted to blow it out. Okay, did he have a mask on?
No.
Any
Zero
kind of
chance of that.
face respirator? Nah. Did he have protective covering over his clothes? Nah. He took those same clothes home, and you're right. His wife washed his clothes. Actually, the first thing he did, because the little kiddies
ran up and hugged
Daddy,
them.
Daddy, Daddy, and he hugged them and he held them and he walked into the house holding them. Now they're breathing that asbestos on his clothes.
And just as the business next door that had the kid that was sweeping the brake dust out the garage door at the end of the day, that was the shop hand, and it was out in the parking lot, and the people that were walking into the business next door, that was the real estate office or whatever, or the gas station that this happened at.
It's easily spread.
It's that
no
kind of
question
thing.
about it.
Another place that I see it too, and you run into this a lot, is vermiculite and that insulation that you see in those older homes. Yeah,
and vermiculite's an interesting product because it's not just used as insulation in attics and walls of older homes. It's also used, and you'll find it in your local garden shop. Now, the beauty of it is that we recognize that a lot of vermiculite insulation that came out of Libby, Montana, predominantly, was contaminated. Asbestos was not included by design. It was just a contaminant in the vermiculite. Vermiculite is just another mineral that is mined. Matter of fact, that's something. Let's go back and talk a little bit about what is the origin of asbestos in a few minutes. Because it's probably. Whoever's listening may not know the origin of it, but vermiculite is a mineral that's mined, and in Libby, Montana, the mine that they were getting it from had contaminants or contaminated veins of asbestos. And it didn't make any difference. It was just another insulating property. So they just kept it right in with the vermiculite. It just didn't make any difference. Well, it does make a difference because if you stir that vermiculite up that contains asbestos, it can be very dangerous. Fact of the matter is, vermiculite by itself, I wouldn't want to be breathing the dust coming off of it. But we do test it for asbestos. It's one of the most difficult products to test for asbestos. The vermiculite mineral is popped like popcorn to give it its light, airy attributes. It also kind of looks like mica, that shiny surface to it. It just, but if there are asbestos chunks in it, that's when it becomes potentially really dangerous to the electrician who's crawling around rewiring an attic or something of that sort, or somebody wanting to put a second story on the house and bringing it out by the shovel full or the bag full. It can be potentially very harmful, and it's very, very difficult to test for. It can be tested with some reliability, but there's a special testing methodology that has been developed by the EPA for it. So if anybody's if anybody runs across something that looks like Captain Crunch breakfast cereal in their attic, that's vermiculite.
So Bob,
good one.
Talk about asbestos, like where it comes from and what makes it so dangerous. And I think from my understanding of it, it lodges into your lung and sort of creates like these little shards of glass that don't ever go away. And that's what creates that asbestosis. And it sort of sits there. And then as you age, it has the potential to become carcinogenic.
Absolutely. Let's back up to what is asbestos? Well, asbestos is not a thing. Asbestos is a form of a mineral. And it's the name asbestos is given to 6 minerals in particular, the most common of which is commonly we refer to as chrysotile asbestos. It's the serpentine mineral. So if you've ever studied rocks and minerals, serpentine was something that you learned about. It's kind of a curly, fibrous thing. You can break it apart and it doesn't look like fiberglass, but it does, if you will. Mm-hmm. There are 6 of these minerals that 4 of which had commercial application, chrysotile or serpentine. Probably 90% of the world's industrial use, commercial use of asbestos was chrysotile asbestos. There are others, no point in naming them because,
that makes great radio.
Before we're off the show. Exactly. But they're broken into two descriptions. Yes. So you've got the chrysotile form and all, and you've also got a couple of them that are referred to as amphiboles, AMPHI, amphibole. Amphiboles are the really short, sharp, almost needle-like forms of the asbestos fiber. Those are the ones that are at least in the United Kingdom, are claimed to be the most dangerous. I think they're all dangerous. But you're right, Caroline. What happens is that you inhale, it gets into the lung. You cannot expectorate it. You can't expel it. It gets stuck down in there. That's what makes it so dangerous. Because your lung has protective abilities, it begins building a mass of tissue around it. Ultimately, that can become a cancerous tumor. It can affect the outer lining of the lungs, and that's something we refer to as mesothelioma. That is that's the end stage. Very, very difficult to treat. There are some treatments for it, but it's pretty much a terminal diagnosis. And the least of which, and you mentioned it, is asbestosis. It's the minor stage. So it's kind of the first stage. And then and I don't mean stage in the sense of cancer, but you've got the asbestosis, then perhaps you end up with these little pockets in your lungs, and then potentially mesothelioma. However, inhalation is not the only method of entry into the body. You don't want to ingest it either, because just as it affects the lining of the lungs, it can affect the stomach and all of the organs. So you don't want to be eating the stuff.
Eric.
Yeah.
Eric, don't be eating that.
Exactly.
Yeah, stop eating that stuff, Eric. I notice your beard is getting a little whiter, my friend. You've been eating
from the asbestos.
That's
from the asbestos
again.
That's what it is. Well, okay, I have a question for you, Bob, because I see this. I was talking to a local Portland high school here, Benson Polytechnic, to their high school class over there. And Mr. Dean over there. Yep. Who is the teacher. I'm walking down the halls of this school, and it's a temporary school because they are remodeling the school that that Benson is in. And so they're in a temporary school, but I have not seen so much 9x9 floor tile in a building as I've seen in this. And I'm looking up and I'm seeing the steam lines for the boiler that are wrapped around the pipes in the ceiling. And, for the heating system in this school, what are the risks that we see with that stuff still installed in buildings like this? And I want to be very clear here. I'm not asking about the risks of this building specifically.
I understand.
But what are the risks that we see in buildings in general with this stuff that's still installed and not technically disturbed?
Well, it's a great question, and it is our school buildings, and in fact, that brought our attention to asbestos and started the first rules of asbestos. The regulation is referred to as HERA. It's an acronym that addresses it in an emergency act. And it is a rule that requires every school building in America, and I think it refers to preschools as well, but definitely the interior of all school buildings have to be inspected first with an initial inspection, and I think it's every 2 to 3 years. We don't get involved with the HERA inspections, so yeah. I'm a little fuzzy on my history with it, but just know that there is a full inventory of every either presumed asbestos-containing material, we refer to that as PACM, or asbestos-containing material, we refer to that as ACM, in every school building throughout America. The maintenance staff knows exactly where every piece of it is, and on a recurring basis, an inspector, such as our company, would go through and go back over that inventory and make sure that the condition of that asbestos-containing material has not degraded since the last inspection. Now, how did this all come about? Well, we, at least as the story goes, the janitors at 5 o'clock in the morning were wiping the dust off of the surface of all of the children's desks and the teacher's desk. Before anybody got there, nobody knew they were doing this, but it was being done every morning. Well, where was that coming from? Well, it was coming from the asbestos ceiling tiles in the classrooms and in the hallways. And that was where we began to realize, wait a minute, there's a whole lot of this stuff in these schools. And a whole section of law was written to protect school children and the people in the schools. So that's really kind of the genesis of our inspection programs.
In our generation, Bob, so, I'm approaching the big 50, which I'm scared to say out loud, but I'm saying it. But we were all
you're just a baby, Caroline.
I wish. Tell that to my bones. But anyway, I think we all went to school and were around all of this asbestos that was not cared for. I mean, I remember walking through all the 9x9 tiles right, Eric? Don't you? All the open plumbing, and like the janitorial staff was just like, you'd walk by and like the service room was open, the mechanical room was open, and you see this stuff just blowing around. So it's terrible.
Yeah.
And how that's going to impact us, we don't know. I mean, it's the
good news with the flooring is there is usually, a 16th inch of old floor wax over the top of it, right? I mean, it was the guy out there riding the buffer all evening and all morning before the kids got there, putting on the latest coat of wax on that floor to make it look good. But the ceiling tiles, as Bob said, were a whole other discussion, when you got into that. Because there was no air filtration in these schools either, because many times they were boiler systems. They just had boiler heat. So air filtration, there's no forced air. So there's nothing to take anything out of the air. it was a sealed box with that stuff trapped.
But I
inside.
wonder if that was better for us, though, because the stuff wasn't blowing around as much either, because we weren't using this forced hot air. It was just kind of settling wherever it settled. We didn't have to deal with
until they cleaned it
right.
up.
Eric, you have just given the perfect description of the difference between friable and non-friable. Those 9x9 tiles, they can remain under your feet all day, all night, 24 hours a day. You can sleep on them. I've heard people say you can lick the tile and you can't get any asbestos out of it, and that's probably true. It is that the matrix, that vinyl matrix, binds that asbestos so tight. Not so much with the ceiling. Those ceilings, and I've only had occasion to test one of them. It was in an old commercial building here in Southeast Portland. And apparently it had been installed very similar to what was in the schools. What I found was almost a chicken wire matrix into which a very high concentration of asbestos containing material had either been sprayed or troweled. I don't know which. I don't know how it was applied, but it was so soft. Did either of you ever throw a pencil up to see if you could get it to stick in the ceiling? Or
oh yeah, they used to do. The guys used to do that all the time.
Oh yes. What are you talking about?
Well, it was that soft, and that was the. So when I'm talking about ceiling tiles, I'm not talking about the ones that drop into the metal grid. These are the
12-inch ones.
Yeah, this was something that actually got put up there in place, and it was just super soft. In fact, I had to ask some questions because I'd never seen one before. I haven't seen one since. It was, but now I understand why it was so hazardous to our health.
But I see, Bob, those in old homes where maybe that old plaster ceiling was failing, and in the 50s and 60s, they put those same 12x12 type tiles up in that home to cover up that ceiling.
Absolutely. And just as important when thinking about the tile itself, that fiber tile, usually those were stuck up with a glue dot, and those glue dots may or may not have asbestos in them. So testing the tile is only a piece of it. You got to get one of the whole ones down so that you can test the adhesive holding it there. That's why I say from 1940 to 1980, asbestos was ubiquitous. It was in everything. It was in your roofing materials. It was in your adhesives. It was in the caulking. It was in the textures. It potentially was in that plaster that you just mentioned. However, unique to everything that I read is that I should be finding asbestos in plaster samples. In the last 6.5 years since I started the company, I have tested thousands of samples of plaster. I can count on two hands because the total is 6. I only have 5 digits on one of my hands. So so I count on 2 hands.
You didn't live up by me by the Hanford Nuclear Reservation then, did you? So.
Yeah. So we've only found 6 samples that had asbestos in them. If you read the books, you find that asbestos was used extensively in plaster. Caroline, I think the books were written on the East Coast.
Great. As I look at plaster walls all around me.
Absolutely. Yep. That's where I'm told that you'll find asbestos in plaster. Out here, what do we find? Well, we're 100 years behind the East Coast, so you find horsehair.
Yep.
We were still riding horses when they were putting asbestos into the plaster out there.
Yeah, you know something? It's interesting, Bob, because you're right, and it's almost like lead paint shows up in tests. It's many times the finer materials, right? And,
absolutely.
And you can find lead paint depending on the paint store in the neighborhood.
Right.
Because if you had a salesperson at the local neighborhood paint store that had that high-end lead paint and loved selling it to everybody, you can find pockets where there is heavy lead paint use in this neighborhood, and maybe 12 blocks away, there's a significantly less of that because that paint store was maybe a different style of neighborhood or a different class of neighborhood, and they didn't use that higher grade of materials.
Well, lead paint was very expensive. Lead-based paint was very expensive. So we know going in to some of the upper end neighborhoods that we'll likely find lead-based paint when testing for it. In the Sears Roebuck Kit home neighborhoods, I guess that's the best way to describe it. Not so much, you know. So you're absolutely right, but it was a high end product, and people with the money paid more for it. And quite frankly, it served them well because it lasted a long time against the weather. It also hardened the paint, so you find it a lot on the interior, on the millwork extensively, because it was a nice hard finish and lasted forever.
You know, it's funny, Bob. I can drive past my parents' old house, the first one I grew up in, up until I was 8. That was painted in the early 70s by my dad. I can drive by that house today in Kennewick, Washington, and that paint is still on the metal siding that's there. And that paint is still on that house today.
Yeah, well, it was good paint. What's the downside? The downside with lead-based paint, as we all know, is that it flakes, it chips ultimately, perhaps, and it gets into the ground, and it's harmful to us if we eat the vegetables because they uptake the lead. If children come by and stick a piece of it in their mouth and taste it, we're talking little kiddies now. Or maybe it's just Sissy is standing at the front window with her hands on the windowsill, the interior ledge of the window, waiting for Daddy to come home. Mom says, "Hey, come get a PB&J." So she sticks a half a sandwich in Sissy's hand. Sissy hasn't washed her hands, so she's intaking or ingesting the lead dust from that lead-based paint as well. So, yeah, the route of entry and the methodology and did they do good? Yeah, it was a great product. Does it have a downside? Absolutely. Unfortunately, and Caroline, you alluded to this a little while ago, what are we doing today that 50 years from now we're going to say, how could we have been so stupid? Or worse than that, our kids and grandkids are going to say, how could they have been so dumb?
And we're doing it. I mean, we know, silica dust is a big thing now that I've had to test for, and probably something you've tested for, but silica dust is becoming, the next kind of asbestos. Homes are so laden with it. They do construction. They don't clean it up. It sits in the ductwork. It starts blowing out through the environment. On top of that, then we've got glyphosate, which is something which for those people who don't know, it's, Roundup is these herbicides that we use are ending up in our ductwork. So there's never going to be a time when we're not employed, Bob, for sure.
You're absolutely
guaranteed
right.
employment.
Yeah, yep. We've confined ours to the world of asbestos. It keeps us full-time busy. But somebody who does broad spectrum testing like you do most of yours through air sampling, don't you?
It depends. It depends what it is. It all varies. Sometimes, we do water testing, we do air sampling, we do swab testing, lifts. We do chemical testing, so sorbent tubes. It really depends what we're testing for. It varies depending on what we're looking for. So,
boy, that sounded like a commercial.
Yeah, think.
Well, it's interesting too, Bob. When you get into this, I wonder, is fiberglass insulation going to be something down the road? And again, I have no.
Yeah, we test for it now. And it's there. Like, the biggest thing is when people have open batting, when I test air, it's one of the things. There's a couple things that I automatically test for. Silica dust is one of them now, fiberglass. But when when people have basements and they're unfinished and they just leave the open batting down there, it's coming up in your air sample. And they go, well, where's the fiberglass? I'm like, you've got open batting. And they go, oh, yeah, I do.
Right.
It's in my basement. So it just gets airborne and you're breathing it in.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's so fascinating because the rules that we go by as far as the asbestos is concerned and why we're testing for it is to keep it out of the transfer station, to keep it out of the dumps, out of the waste stream, if you will. And there is a specific exclusion for rock wool or mineral wool, as they refer to it, and fiberglass insulation. So we know that if it looks like fiberglass and it's white, pink, or yellow, or it's black because that's mineral wool, we don't even need to bother testing for it because there's a full exemption on that. I think you're absolutely right, Caroline. Where are we going to be 50 years from now as we see people with these glass fiber issues? The substantive difference, I believe, and based on the reading I've done, is that at least the body is somewhat able to get rid of that glass fiber. It doesn't have barbs on it like the asbestos does.
There you go. As I'm looking at my ceiling of my mineral wool insulation in my garage.
I wondered what you were. I thought maybe you had bats
freaks
in
you
your
out.
belfry.
I'm feeling like I don't want to. I'm feeling like I don't want to breathe right now. I'm like, I'm like looking around, going, "Oh man." Bob, the problem we have in the Northeast, we don't have a lot of good asbestos contractors anymore. I remember about 10 years ago having someone who had, one of my clients had a massive asbestos problem, and there was nobody to refer them to. Like, it was like they just stopped doing remediation, and there's very few companies doing it anymore. A lot of people have gone into mold and restoration and that kind of thing, but not asbestos. Is that a problem that we're going to see moving forward?
Boy, I don't know, because we do not have that issue out here. That's the first I've heard of it. However, if I were to just speculate, I'd say, you know what? Asbestos carries with it currently much higher risk of litigation down the road than, say, dealing with a mold issue, which in some states is an unregulated remediation. Abatement of asbestos is a highly regulated trade. So it may very well be that people are moving out of it to avoid some of the risk of litigation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it years ago. And I don't, like, honestly, I haven't looked so recently, but I remember going back about 10 years ago, you couldn't find anybody to do it. It was a nightmare. There was like one company, and that was reputable and good. There were a couple companies that were like, you know, not the greatest, I would say, on the shady side. But yeah, it was a problem, and I'm sure it still is.
May very well be, but we have not encountered that yet, fortunately. And I am delighted that we have a very deep bench of asbestos abatement contractors. The bench of asbestos
Me too.
building inspectors is getting deeper too, I might add.
I've got plenty of stuff for you to inspect, Bob. Just come on over. I'll train you right up, and you'll be good to go.
Bob, we're talking, Oregon and, of course, Carolina, New Jersey here, but across the country, for the whole listening audience out there, it's a state-by-state thing. There are some states that take this seriously, and others are looking the other way.
Absolutely. And in fact, we occasionally will have a call from somebody from out of state who has been hired by a commercial retail establishment to do a fit up in a shopping mall someplace, a tenant improvement. They'll give us a call and say, hey, I've got all of this debris sitting here, and now I can't get a dumpster. Okay, well, any damage that was going to be done to their crew has already been done. The good news is, in most shopping malls, they're so new that asbestos was not being used, although we do occasionally still find it. But these are folks from out of state, and I just shake my head and say, how, why do they not know? What is it about their state that makes them different? And I'm going to tell you that the one that really surprised me the most, and it's a recurring thing, is the state of California. These contractors are coming up from California and they say, we go into these shopping malls in our own home state. We just get a dumpster and throw this stuff away. I don't know whether to believe them or not, but they're certainly coming here and trying to do the same thing. And it's just, state of Oregon says, no, don't think so. And their training has been so good since that January 1, 2016 date that we were talking about, that they have the landfills trained. They have the transfer stations trained. They have the commercial waste haulers trained. They've got, here's one for you, they've got Home Depot trained to the point where the Home Depot carpet installer is going to come out and he says, I can't put down carpet until you have that floor tested.
Yep, absolutely.
So, yeah,
it's amazing.
We live in I think this state is really kind of on the bleeding edge. State of Washington is right up there with them. We do. Yep. We work both states.
Yeah, and it's something that
you are so much stricter out there with everything. I mean, New Jersey, and think about it. Asbestos came from New Jersey. I mean, Johns Manville was here, and I definitely think we should be way, way, way more strict than we are. I mean, I think you need a license to remove it. That's obviously the state benefits from that, but I don't really see strict guidelines here for asbestos.
It's interesting you say that because we are one of the last nations in the, I'm not sure how to describe it. It's not, I guess, in the industrialized world.
Yeah.
Where it's even a legal commodity. It's illegal. Eric, you'll appreciate this. Matter of fact, you might have been the one who turned me on to an article about trying to import into Australia muscle cars. Muscle cars had a lot of asbestos in headliners, firewalls, brakes, clutches, things like that. You
pipe wraps on the exhaust. Yep.
It's going to take $10,000 to have that car torn down part by part by part, and any asbestos-containing part replaced with a third-party replacement. $10,000 just to get it into Australia. They are dead serious about not having any importation of asbestos.
And they force you to make it right-hand drives like the rest of their cars as well. So you have to convert that dash of that 63 Corvette split window to be driving on the other side. It ain't cheap.
I'll bet not. But when you in the next iteration, because of your love of muscle cars and the like, I can see you doing that show next.
In my spare time, right, Bob?
In your spare time. It'll just be like that graveyard show that you and I used to watch in the studio from time to time.
Absolutely. Well, Bob, we are running out of time today. This is always the fastest hour of radio, as you have always said, for the last 15 years or so. But how do people track down your company if they're in Oregon and Washington and want to have your team come out and check to see what's ugly on their job site?
Easiest way, go to our website, envirotest.biz, stands for business. We don't spell it right. Envirotest, all one word, .biz.
There we go. Bob, thanks for coming on today, brother. You are such an around-the-house veteran, and this show would not be here today without your decade of hard work.
He is around the house. What are you kidding me?
He is around the house. You got it.
Thank you for not making me feel like a third wheel, because I certainly could have been.
Caroline, it was such a pleasure meeting you in person. It was great. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Well, Bob, thanks, you know how the rest of this goes. I'm Eric G.
I'm Caroline B.
I'm Handyman Bob.
And you've been listening to Around the House.
Somewhere unseen and undiscovered, anywhere is a love song. Let's be lovers. We're all over the radio. Take my hand, I know where to go. All over the radio with you.
Hey, it's Eric G from Around the House. Are you planning a decking or siding project this year? If you are, you've got to check out my friends at Millboard. Millboard is a completely different kind of composite decking and cladding that enhances outdoor spaces with enduring distinction. Hand molded from the finest oak, it realistically mimics the natural grain and color of premium hardwood. If you're looking for something that doesn't look like plastic and instead real wood, check out millboard.com. Make sure and check out that interview we did just a few weeks back. That's millboard.com.